Here, what's necessary is to carry out enough of an educational program so that people are not deluded by the constant flood of lies and distortion. I mean, when people hear every day unremitting claims that, of course, Israel had a right to invade Gaza in self-defense, it's not very hard to explain to people that there's absolutely no basis for that. It takes like 2 minutes. And if enough people are convinced, they can also be organized to do something about it. So among the many tasks that have been carried out over the years, this doesn't really seem to be like a very hard one, and we know how to do it. It requires organization and activism and educational efforts.
Some of what you say reminds me of what happened to the people and presumably the culture of Diego Garcia. But the question I have for you is, there are progressive Palestinians and progressive Israelis who are now pushing for a one-state solution, which would clearly, it seems to me, put the government of Israel in the light of an apartheid regime, because it will not be able to maintain, what it's trying to do without doing something closer to what happened in South Africa under apartheid. Is that a useful strategy, the one-state solution for activists?
Well, first of all, a one-state solution is sort of meaningless. I mean, what would make sense to look forward to is a binational state. I mean, you got two separate communities, different cultures, different languages. It could be a multinational state. And that's a reasonable objective. I mean, I've believed in it all my life. But you have to make a distinction between proposing something and advocating it. Like, we can propose that everybody ought to live in peace, beat your swords into plowshares, let's all love each other. Nice proposal. But it isn't advocacy. It becomes advocacy when you spell out a path from here to there. Now, there is a way to advocate a binational state. In fact, one and only one way, as far as I'm aware of, and that's to begin with a two-state settlement. It has to be approached in stages. Now, there was a time when it could have been implemented directly. That was first of all, before 1948 it could have been, but since 1948 it could have been implemented in the period from about 1967 up to 75. In fact, something like it was even advocated by Israeli military intelligence, but the government turned it down. But during that point, it could be literally advocated. Israel was in a position to implement it. And there was discussion of it at the time. I wrote about it a lot, in fact. But it was absolute anathema, bitterly condemned. And the reason was it was feasible. Now it's tolerated, in fact encouraged. So you can read proposals about it in the New York Times and the New York Review of Books. But why is it tolerated now but anathema then? Because now it's completely unfeasible. So therefore it serves only to undermine what might be the first stage towards achieving it. So therefore it's popular. Now, I'm not suggesting that those who propose it are trying to undermine a settlement. Of course they're not trying to, but they're doing it. And that's why what they're doing is tolerated. You should think that through. Why was it anathema when it was feasible, but tolerated now that it's totally unfeasible? It has no support anywhere. It's not at all like South Africa. If you look back at the South African illustration, is actually a good model, but you have to pay attention to what happened. First of all, Israel, under the current U.S.-Israeli policies, Convergence Plus, Israel's not going to become an apartheid state. It's going to be demographically, ethnically pure. It's going to include Jews and kick out Palestinians, including those who are in Israel. So the apartheid issue will never arise. Furthermore, in the case of South Africa, it did make sense to have boycotts and divestment and so on, but to end apartheid. But that was first of all, because South Africa could not get rid of its black population. It's not like Israel, they're delighted to get rid of the Palestinian population. South Africa couldn't. It's their entire workforce. It's 85% of the population. In fact, that's why South Africa developed the Bantustans. They wanted them to be viable because they needed them, and therefore they became an apartheid state. But even in that case, the protests against apartheid took decades before they developed. I mean, the major programs of, boycott, divestment, and so on were actually in the 1980s. That was after decades of educational effort. It was at a time when there was nobody speaking in favor of apartheid. I mean, literally, it was gone. Congress was passing anti-apartheid legislation. The U.S. corporations were opposed to it. They wanted to end it. It was bad for business. And at that point, you could have boycott, divestment programs, which were in fact effective and important in kind of intensifying and dramatizing these efforts, and they had an effect. But the situation in this case is totally different. I mean, the South African model is just irrelevant. I mean, you can talk about a one-state settlement, but it's on a par with calling for everyone to live in peace. That would be nice too. But what's the path to get there? Well, there is a path. It would start with a two-state settlement, which frankly the whole world, including the U.S. population, favors. That would cut back the level of violence. It would set a stage, set up the circumstances in which possibly, in fact I think likely, relations between the two states would grow, commercial relations, cultural relations, commerce, cross-border, and so on. And maybe it would, as circumstances permit, lead to proposals for closer integration, which would make a lot of sense. But if there's another form of advocacy of a binational state, I haven't heard of it. That's the only form I've ever heard of. And I think the appeal, which many good activists are entering into for a one-state settlement, is simply a diversionary force which is undermining the possibilities for peace and even undermining the possibilities for an eventual integration into a single state.